The streets of New York City were alive with movement. Cars honked impatiently, pedestrians rushed to their destinations, and the cold winter air carried the scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby street vendor. Donald Trump sat in the back of his car, glancing over documents, preparing for yet another meeting. It was supposed to be just another day in the bustling city, until something caught his eye. At the corner of Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street, a man sat hunched against the brick wall of an old bookstore. He was wrapped in a tattered military jacket, its once proud insignia now faded and barely visible. A frayed blanket was draped over his shoulders, but it was no match for the biting wind. Beside him was a simple cardboard sign with bold, uneven letters. "I am a veteran. Please help." Trump felt something tighten in his chest. He had passed countless homeless people in New York before. Everyone had. The city was full of stories, full of suffering, full of people who had been forgotten by the world. But something about this man made him pause. Maybe it was the way he sat, not slumped in defeat, but upright, as if still holding onto some remnant of dignity. Maybe it was the eyes, tired but alert, scanning the passers-by who pretended not to see him. "Stop the car," Trump ordered. His driver hesitated. "Sir, we have—" "Just stop." The car slowed to a halt. Security detail tensed, but they knew better than to argue. Trump stepped out into the cold, pulling his coat tighter around him. The moment he approached, the man flinched slightly, his grip tightening on his blanket. Trump crouched down to his level, ignoring the curious glances from pedestrians. "Hello," he said, his voice softer than usual. "What's your name?" The man hesitated. His lips were chapped, his voice hoarse. "Mike," he finally answered. "Mike Miller." Trump extended a hand, and after a moment, Mike shook it, his fingers icy. "Tell me your story, Mike." Mike's throat moved as he swallowed, as if unsure where to begin. He pulled his blanket tighter around him. "I joined the military when I was 22, he said, his voice rough and uneven. "Served 2 tours in Afghanistan. Came back, but nothing was the same." Trump nodded, listening. "I got injured in a blast. Lost some of my hearing, damaged my leg. The Army gave me medical treatment, but they don't fix what's inside." Mike took a shaky breath. "My family didn't know what to do with me. They said I was different, hard to be around. Eventually, they stopped calling. Then I lost my job. And when I couldn't pay my debts, I lost my home." His fingers trembled as he spoke. "Last winter," he continued, "I was sleeping outside the train station. There was another guy next to me, a Vietnam vet. He was sick. He didn't make it through the night." Trump's jaw tightened. "I woke up next to him, and he was just gone, still wrapped in his blanket. I called the cops, but by then, it was too late." Mike's voice dropped to a whisper. "That could be me. Next time, it could be me." Silence settled between them. The city continued its restless movement, but in that moment, nothing else seemed to matter. Trump took a deep breath, then spoke, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "A man like you should never be in this situation," he said. "You gave your life to serve this country, and yet this country has failed you." Mike blinked, as if unsure he had heard correctly. "This has to change," Trump said. "I promise you it will." Mike stared at him, disbelief and a flicker of hope mixing in his expression. "Really? Would you do this for me?" Without hesitation, Trump replied, "Yes, Mike. You fought for this country. Now this country needs to fight for you." And with those words, the course of Mike Miller's life began to change. Trump didn't hesitate. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number. "Get me a room at the plaza," he said firmly. "Something private. And send a doctor. Now." His security detail exchanged uncertain glances. They had seen Trump make bold moves before, but this was different. This wasn't business. This was personal. Trump turned to one of his bodyguards. "Get some hot food. Something real. Not a sandwich, something warm." The man nodded and quickly disappeared into the crowd. Mike watched the entire exchange with wary eyes. His fingers clenched the edges of his frayed blanket, his body tense. "Why are you doing this?" he muttered. Trump crouched beside him again. Because you deserve better, he said simply. Mike shook his head. You don't even know me. I know enough, Trump replied. You served this country. You lost everything. And now you're out here, forgotten. That's not right. Mike let out a hollow chuckle. Lots of guys have it worse. That doesn't mean you don't deserve help, Trump said. His voice wasn't commanding like it was at his rallies. It was steady, calm, convincing. Mike glanced down at his hands. People walk by me every day. They don't stop. They don't see me. Why are you any different? Trump sighed. Because I can do something about it. And I will. Before Mike could argue, the bodyguard returned, carrying a steaming takeout container. The scent of roasted chicken and hot soup filled the cold air. Mike stiffened. His stomach clenched painfully at the smell, reminding him just how long it had been since he'd had real food. Trump took the container, opened it, and handed it to Mike. Eat. Mike hesitated. He glanced at Trump, then at the food. His fingers trembled as he picked up the plastic spoon and dipped it into the soup. The moment the hot broth touched his tongue, something inside him broke. His chest tightened. His throat closed up. It had been so long. So long since he had eaten something that wasn't from a dumpster or handed out at a shelter. The warmth spread through him, chasing away the cold that had settled deep into his bones. He swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. It's been a long time, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Trump nodded, watching him carefully. Mike took another spoonful, then another. The tension in his shoulders eased just slightly. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel invisible. After he finished the meal, Trump stood and motioned to his security detail. Let's go. Mike looked up at him, confused. Go where? To the plaza, Trump said. You need a warm bed, a shower, real clothes. And after that, we're going to figure out what's next. Mike swallowed, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. I don't. Trump held up a hand. No arguments. You've had to fight for everything. Tonight, you don't have to. For a moment, Mike sat there, unmoving. Then, slowly, he nodded. One of the bodyguards helped him to his feet. His legs were stiff from the cold, and he swayed slightly. As they walked toward the car, Mike couldn't help but glance over his shoulder at the spot where he had been sitting just moments ago. That corner had been his home for months, and now, for the first time in forever, he was leaving it behind. The morning sunlight streamed through the large windows of the Plaza Hotel, casting a warm glow over the elegantly set breakfast table. A fresh pot of coffee sat beside a plate of eggs, toast, and fruit. The scent of brewed coffee mixed with the faint aroma of polished wood and expensive cologne. Mike Miller sat stiffly in his chair, feeling strangely out of place. The soft robe draped over his shoulders, the clean clothes he now wore. It all felt surreal. Less than 24 hours ago, he had been sitting on a freezing sidewalk, invisible to the world. Now, he was here, inside, warm, fed. He had barely slept. Not because the bed wasn't comfortable. It was the softest thing he had ever laid on. But because his mind wouldn't stop racing. He kept expecting to wake up back on the street, to find that this had all been a cruel dream. And yet, here he was. Across from him, Donald Trump sat sipping his coffee, flipping through his phone. He glanced up, noticing the way Mike kept shifting in his seat. Relax, Trump said. You look like you're about to be court-martialed. Mike let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. Just not used to this. Trump set his phone down and leaned forward. Well, get used to it, he said. Because things are about to change. Mike raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Trump took a slow sip of coffee before answering. I made some calls last night, he said. I got in touch with Veterans United, an organization that helps homeless vets get back on their feet. Mike froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. What? Trump nodded. They're going to help you rebuild. Housing, job training, medical care, whatever you need. He leaned back in his chair, watching Mike's reaction carefully. I'll cover all your expenses for the first year. Mike's hand trembled as he set his cup down. He blinked, as if struggling to process what he had just heard. You're serious? Trump nodded. Mike swallowed hard. His throat tightened, and he exhaled shakily. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Trump replied. Just take the chance. At that moment, the door opened, and a man in a navy blue suit entered the dining room. He was in his mid-40s, with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority. He walked over to the table and extended his hand. Mike, my name is David Carter, he introduced himself. I work with Veterans United. It's good to meet you. Mike shook his hand, still in shock. You're really here? David smiled. I am, and I'm here to help. He pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. We've reviewed your situation, and we have a plan in place for you. First, we'll arrange for you to move into temporary housing, your own space, safe and warm. From there, we'll work on long-term housing options. Mike stared at him, unblinking. David continued, flipping through the documents. We'll also enroll you in job training programs that match your skills. If you're interested, we can help you find work in security, mechanics, IT, whatever you feel comfortable with. Mike let out a shaky breath, his fingers tightening around the table's edge. And, David added, we'll make sure you receive medical care, physical therapy for your leg, mental health support, whatever you need. Mike shook his head in disbelief. I don't deserve all this. Trump set his coffee cup down with a firm clink. Bullshit, he said bluntly. Mike looked up, startled. Trump leaned forward, locking eyes with him. You served your country. You put your life on the line. You lost everything. And now, you're getting back what you should have had all along. Mike's chest rose and fell rapidly. His vision blurred for a moment. He blinked quickly, trying to fight the overwhelming emotion threatening to spill over. David placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You're not alone anymore, Mike. Mike exhaled slowly, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at Trump, then at David, then back down at the folder in front of him. For the first time in years, hope felt real. He wasn't just being handed a few dollars. He wasn't being given temporary relief. He was being given a second chance, and he was going to take it. Mike sat in stunned silence, staring at the folder of documents in front of him. His mind struggled to grasp the reality of the situation: housing, job training, medical care. It was too much, too good to be true. Across the table, Donald Trump watched him carefully. He could see the hesitation, the disbelief. He had seen that look before, the look of a man who had spent too long expecting disappointment. Trump reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a checkbook. With a smooth motion, he flipped it open, clicked his pen, and began writing. The only sound in the room was the scratch of the pen against paper. Mike glanced up. What are you doing? Trump didn't look up as he signed his name. Making sure you don't have to worry about the little things while you get back on your feet. He tore the check from the book and slid it across the table. Mike hesitated before picking it up. His eyes widened as he saw the amount. Sir, this is too much. His voice was barely above a whisper. Trump shook his head. It's enough to get you started. New clothes, transportation, whatever you need. He leaned forward, fixing Mike with a serious look. No excuses. No second-guessing. You use it. Mike swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the check. His throat felt dry, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. Trump's expression softened slightly. You know, he said, one day, someone else is going to need help. Maybe not the way you needed it, but in their own way. And when that time comes, you're going to remember this moment. Mike blinked rapidly, fighting the sting behind his eyes. Trump continued, when that moment comes, you help them. You pay it forward. Mike clenched his jaw and nodded. I will. His voice was rough, raw with emotion. I swear, I will. Trump studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod of approval. Good. Mike looked down at the check again, his vision blurring. He had no words, only an overwhelming sense of gratitude swelling in his chest. For so long, he had been invisible, forgotten, just another face on the street. But now he had a chance, a real chance. He lifted his gaze to Trump, and for the first time in years, there was something new in his eyes. Hope. Trump saw it and smiled. Let's get to work, he said. Later that afternoon, Mike stood near the window of his hotel room, looking down at the bustling streets of New York. It felt surreal. Just yesterday, he had been one of the people down there, just another forgotten soul, blending into the background of the city. Now, he was inside, warm, safe, with a future that no longer seemed like a distant dream. He glanced at the neatly folded clothes on the bed. A clean pair of jeans, a button-up shirt, and a jacket, simple, but his. Not charity hand-me-downs, not something he had scavenged from a shelter. His own clothes, for his own fresh start. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. "Come in," he called. The door opened, and Donald Trump stepped inside, followed by David Carter from Veterans United. Mike straightened slightly, still adjusting to the idea that people like this were here for him. "You look better," Trump observed, nodding approvingly. "Rested." Mike gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "First time I slept in a real bed in a long time." Trump chuckled. "Good. Get used to it." He motioned to David. "We've got some things to go over." David stepped forward, holding a few documents. "Mike, we've arranged everything for your transition. A temporary apartment, fully furnished, so you don't have to worry about anything. It's in a quiet area, good neighbors, close to resources." Mike inhaled sharply, nodding as he listened. "We've also lined up job interviews," David continued. "Based on your background, we think you'd be a great fit for a security position, but there are other options too. We'll help you with training, getting the right certifications, whatever you need to move forward." Mike ran a hand over his jaw, absorbing it all. "I don't know how to thank you," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. Trump placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "Just don't waste the opportunity." Mike nodded, swallowing past the lump in his throat. Trump studied him for a moment. "There's one last thing," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small black leather wallet and handed it to Mike. Mike hesitated before taking it. The weight of it felt unfamiliar in his hands. He opened it slowly. Inside was an ID, a prepaid debit card, and some cash. "It's not just about having money," Trump said. "It's about having identity again. You're not just some guy on the streets anymore, Mike. You're somebody." Mike gripped the wallet tightly. Somebody. He liked the sound of that. Trump exhaled, satisfied. "Let's go see your new place." As they stepped out into the crisp air, Mike didn't just feel different. He was different. The screen flickered to life. Donald Trump sat behind a polished wooden desk, the city skyline visible through the window behind him. His expression was serious but calm. The camera zoomed in as he leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. "I want to talk about something important," he began, his voice steady. "About people, about second chances, and about the power of a single decision." A montage began to play. Mike stepping into his new apartment, running his fingers along the clean walls. Mike shaking hands with his job trainer. Mike looking in the mirror, seeing a man with dignity staring back at him. "There are people out there, good people, who have been forgotten," Trump continued. "Veterans, workers, fathers, mothers, people who gave everything for this country and found themselves with nothing." The footage cut to a clip of Mike, standing at his apartment window, looking out at the world, not as an outsider, but as someone with a place in it. "But the truth is," Trump said, "they're not lost causes. They don't need pity. They don't need handouts. They need a chance." Another clip showed Mike attending a training session, nodding as an instructor walked him through security protocols. "I stopped on the street that day because I saw a man who deserved better," Trump said. "And the truth is, there are thousands, millions, like him." The screen faded to black for a moment. Then, it showed Mike again, this time in his security uniform, standing at the entrance of a corporate building. His shoulders were squared, his head held high. "You don't have to be rich to change someone's life," Trump said. "You just have to care enough to try." The final shot was of Mike walking into his apartment, shutting the door behind him. For Mike, everything changed because of one moment, Trump concluded. "And maybe that moment starts with you." The screen faded to black. Then, in white letters, the final words appeared. "One act of kindness can change a life. Be that act." Months had passed. The air was warmer now, the sharp bite of winter replaced by the fresh scent of spring. New York City still pulsed with life. Cars honking, people rushing, the never-ending movement of a place that never stopped. But this time, Mike Miller wasn't just another face lost in the crowd. He stood tall outside the office building where he now worked as a security officer. His uniform was crisp, his posture straight, his eyes sharp and alert. It felt good to have a purpose again, to have people greet him by name when they walked through the doors, to matter. At the end of his shift, he grabbed a coffee from a nearby cart and walked toward the subway. But as he passed a familiar intersection, his steps slowed. There, on the same corner where he once sat, where his life had nearly ended before it truly began, a young man huddled against the brick wall, clutching a thin jacket around his shoulders. Mike felt his chest tighten. He knew that look, the look of a man who had lost everything. He stepped forward. "Hey," he said gently. The man flinched, just like he once had. Mike crouched down, ignoring the rush of pedestrians moving past them. "What's your name?" he asked. The man hesitated, his fingers gripping a battered backpack. "James," he muttered. Mike nodded. "James, listen, I know it's tough right now, but you don't have to do this alone." James looked up, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Mike reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black leather wallet, the same one Trump had given him that day. Inside, he had placed a prepaid card, some cash, and a note. He handed it to James, who looked at it in disbelief. "Why?" he whispered. Mike smiled. "Because someone once did the same for me." James swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he accepted it. Mike stood up and pulled out his phone. "Come on. I know a place that can help." As they walked toward the subway together, Mike glanced up at the towering skyline, a quiet thank you in his heart. He had kept his promise, and now it was his turn to change someone's life.